Thanks so much for talking to us, Mary.
Thank you.
You are the chair of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council of Australia. So if I was to ask you about the particular issues facing older, culturally and linguistically diverse men and women, what's the first set of issues that comes to mind?
Well, the first set of issues that come to mind is learning to look after themselves. So how do you become an older person in Australia if you're from that background and do that in a way that fulfills your life? That's always very challenging for all.
Why is that?
Well, because you can't go and sit in a village square necessarily. You've got to adjust and go to a coffee shop or do things a bit differently. Where people have come from, there was role models on how their grandparents aged, and they come here and they are ageing in a different space. I think
So they've got to make it up as they go along.
They've got to age in a different country. So it's a country that they've known as young adults, and then as people taking kids to schools. But as they get older, they've not seen their own parents age here, so they have to make it up as they go along. Basically, they are people who experience different cultures and may speak a different language as they lose their English, but their ageing into place is learning to be the entire diversity that we are. So I think that part of what's going on in Australia for older people of called background is that they are learning to age here, and what that means when you speak a language other than English, when your culture is different. So many of them, I think, will also be challenged because their expectations of what it is to be old may be different from their children's, and the speed of change, technology, women working, families breaking up, are all things that they don't know naturally how to deal with, so they're learning to do that on the job as well.
Talk a bit more about that intergenerational differences of expectation. Give us an example of that.
A really good example, I think, is of an expectation of what the role of women is in society. So women are increasingly in paid employment. They are often seen as second income earners and essential to pay the bills, and less at home. And many women are engaged in voluntary work, so even if they're not in paid work, they're still active. So the role of women is a really big difference between what I think is evolving today and what older called people would have been used to.
And how might that tension play out?
Well, the tension plays out when there isn't a caregiver, when you're 83 and there isn't a woman who's 52 and the child at home willing to sacrifice their own career for the option of caring for an elder person home. So I think the absence of the home carers, the women that stayed at home and raised children and then immediately as the children became young adults started to care immediately for their parents, that role of women has changed. They are caring for their parents in different ways. So maybe they're employing people, maybe they're using aged care, maybe older people are engaging differently, but certainly the role of women, I think, is the most significant impact on called communities.
How vulnerable are older people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds in Australia as they come to age? What vulnerabilities does that bring with it?
Isolation is probably the greatest, lack of social contact. So many of them worked in manufacturing and low-paid jobs, which meant that they didn't acquire a great deal of English, and as they aged, their English deteriorated. And then slowly their peers start to pass away, so their circles become smaller and smaller. Their lack of time, and most of them being working class people who didn't go to restaurants and didn't socialise in the way that perhaps people were socialising now, meant that their activities were fairly limited, and the importance of their ethnic community was really important to them. As they got older, the transportation's an issue, their capacity to engage deteriorates, and so their isolation from others is the greatest impact on them. Even going to church becomes an issue because there's no one to take them, they can't drive themselves anymore, so they stop going to church or the mosque or whatever it is that they go to. So even that basic interaction, which was natural, ceases because everybody's busy around them. So the isolation also leads to them being at risk because we don't know what happens behind walls. So two people who maybe lived a life together, we don't know what happens there, and certainly the interaction of young adults with, vulnerable, isolated people is something that I think we ought to be watching. I think that the other exploitation that is possible, because they don't understand their rights and the responsibilities of others towards them, is financial exploitation. The whole issue of what is theirs becomes everyone's, and there's a sense of entitlement. That the wealth accumulated by the older migrant ought to be spent on them as they age themselves. They should be able to spend money on themselves so that they live good lives. Whether that's the expectation that's shared by other family members. So, do they feel guilty to book the second and third physiotherapist when it's costing a lot of money? Or do they just squirrel money away? And is that encouraged? So it's a matter of whether older people of call backgrounds in their isolated situations feel confident that they should live the best life that they can, even if they spend the family fortune doing it. Well, good on them, because that money is, they've worked for that money and they should be able to spend it on themselves.
When second, third generation Australians sit down and try and imagine or investigate what elder abuse is, how to define it, and what a national strategy might look like, what are the things that they might overlook in those basic issues of definitions and so forth, if they're not aware of the particular cultural background of an older person from a particular community?
Culture is a fascinating thing. We've all got it. And Australian culture, of course, Australian migration culture is, of course, a mix-up of everything that is people's experience. So none of us are pure here. So my parents, while they migrated from Greece, they have, after living here for 55, 60 years, have actually become very Australian. In fact, it's really interesting. The Greeks are fascinating because they've created a Gringlish. So they've got words, English words that they've added so that they sound more Greek. So a roof is a rufi, which is actually they've got a Greek word for roof. But
which is?
But they morph it. So the basi is the bus, which is in Greek, the leuphoreo. So there's a language that's formed. It's fascinating. A language that's formed by people who kind of learnt an odd word of English and added it to their Greek vocabulary.
Just to make it sound more Greek, even though it's not a Greek word.
And just to make it sound more English, even though it wasn't. So it's quite a bizarre phenomenon. But what that shows is that they are people that have got, their cultures are kind of morphed into each other, but they also clash. So there's certain things, as you're growing up, for instance, traditional families remember what life was like, and so they're a bit more perhaps strict on kids. So they bring that here, but that morphs itself over time. So you get this funny sort of clash and then morphing of cultures. So for older people, what you find is that they have an expectation that someone will look after them. But they know, because they've been here for 60 years, that it's actually not possible. Uh-huh. But they haven't done enough to, create the scaffolding around themselves as an older person to prevent them being at risk. So while they know it, they kind of live in hope. It's almost like, I guess the parallel when they were younger is that they would hope that all their children went to university and married doctors. They didn't put scaffolding around those kids that didn't get to university and marry doctors. They kind of just hope for the best. But so as the older people, they did very much. They are at risk because there is nothing there for them. The other thing that they didn't anticipate is that they didn't anticipate losing their English. So as people become isolated and stop conversing, so they don't go to work anymore, they don't go, they only talk to each other as increasingly small group of people. They lose English, and dementia, of course, means that you lose your last language. So you regress back to your original language that you learned as a child. So they didn't bank on that at all. They thought that they would be. So my father, for instance. He worked, in fact, he was an electrician in the Opera House. He worked in the Opera House. I remember as a kid going there, school holidays, sitting in the bowels of the Opera House while he went off and, did what electricians do. And his English was quite good, but he's now lost it entirely. He didn't factor that in. So the importance of having information in their own languages. For those people that migrated post-World War II and those people that are ageing now, we owe it to them, knowing what they contributed, to have language services that fills the gap that they thought that they had filled by learning English. Like, I remember Dad coming home and he would flick on, English language tapes, those big old tapes, and he would, as he was helping Mum cook dinner, they would both practice their English so that they could get good at speaking English. And they lost it. So I feel a great obligation, given their efforts to build a family and, contribute to Australia and to learn language, to now try to fill that gap that they didn't anticipate.
And I guess in thinking about the potential for abuse, it's in the absence of those sorts of efforts to bring that sort of scaffolding to older people to meet their vulnerability that you leave them at risk.
Absolutely.
Of abuse.
Yeah. So language is the key. I mean, we can understand culture and we can try to get it, but as I said earlier, culture is a moving feast. So trying to understand a particular culture's approach to, I don't know, what you do with a family home, Personally, I think Australian rules and regulations supersede any of that anyway. So I think we need to understand, everyone needs to get what we expect of each other as a nation. We then can kind of put the filter of culture on that and think, the classic example is, people's home belongs to them and they can't be forced to hand it over to somebody else. But that's a rule that we do. We have rules against people being able to forcibly, take people's property away from them. But if the culture is that there needs to be painted bright blue and you need to put pillars up the front, well, we can live with that one, sort of. But so culture is what it is. But language is the key. I mean, there was a wonderful.
Is the key to what?
Is the key to them being able to live as good a life as possible and minimise the risk of abuse. The interesting thing about language is that we forget how critical it is until we're exposed to situations where we don't have it ourselves. So my investment, and certainly what we encourage as much as possible to government and to the not-profit sector and to anyone who listen, is that we need to make sure that we're providing available, accessible, appropriate information in languages that people can understand to the people that need it.
You're talking about the post-World War II
Yes.
Generation of migrants to Australia. What about the newer communities?
I think, there's a couple of things that are really critical there. One is let's have learnt what we need to do so that we don't repeat some of the mistakes. So for them, hopefully, it will be a bit better. For the newer communities who are older now and who are migrants right now, it's very tricky. One of the things that what we've found is that visible difference makes a difference. There are some issues that pertain to the racism that they may be experiencing in the possible between cultures and around cultures. So I know that African communities in particular have not only the risk of abuse but the risk of stigma and discrimination to deal with. So that's really tricky for them. And the importance for all of us to make sure that information is got to them really, really quickly. Their numbers are also really small, so that means that you don't have the services. So the Greeks and the Italians and the Vietnamese have created a bit of an infrastructure around themselves. They've got some basic services they can tune into, whereas new arrived communities are kind of very bare bones. There's not much. There's no places for them to go. They often even aren't, qualified interpreters in their languages out there in the workforce. So it's really hard. So I just think that their issues are similar, probably more acute. And I think that abuse is abuse, that you can't camouflage abuse by saying that it's culture. It's a little bit like some of the issues around, female genital mutilation. You just can't say that it's acceptable because it's a cultural practice. We live in a country that has certain standards, and those standards apply to everyone equally. So I don't think we should move from that, nor should we use any excuse to do that.
Wonderful to talk to you, Mary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.